Hi, everybody. Welcome today to our first Hot Planet Repair Team webinar of 2023. I think this year is going to be a lot different from last year when it comes up to what the world's going to see in recycling and the issues that they deal with, the history of circularity as this subject becomes more popular and increasingly relevant in all of our daily lives, whether I'm walking around the streets of Amsterdam, seeing the wonderful trash that the tourists leave behind, or wherever you all live and the waste that you see that just comes up in its different ways. I'm somebody that loves history. I believe that in order to move into the future in the right directions, you have to understand the past, make sure history doesn't repeat itself. History often rhymes. We're making a lot of new discoveries in the world of history because of the technological leaps that we've been able to make in the past decade, especially, whether it's changing how archaeology works or it's even looking at linguistics across different places and spaces. I'm excited about what the world's going to do with historians and current life cycle analysis folks, ecosystem people. Humanity has been doing a spectacular job at turning nature into trash for hundreds of years. There's a quote that Alan recently shared out to the group from some academic person who described exactly that humanity turns nature into trash. And we need to start doing the opposite, turning our trash into treasure and all having pleasure in coming together to do that. Across our webinars so far, we've really delved into the global history of waste, pollution, because that's a form of waste, right? Recycling, understanding where are things going. What we want to do now is really ground ourselves, look at different places and cases of how we've been trashing these spaces that we should care a lot more about because they are our ecosystems, our economics. The word eco means home. Some of our team members here call this place home, as well as many of my family members nowadays, actually. I think we got Tyler, Alan on the call right now, who are both out of Florida. Anything you'd like to say, either of you, about today's webinar in the Florida case before we move ahead?
Well, I just have to say that the highest point in Florida is the trash pile.
Boo, boo.
There we go.
And the largest landfill in the world is the oceans.
There we go. And Florida's surrounded by it and has tons and tons of growth and economic development to deal with. One of my favorite philosophical and practical questions in sustainability is how do you balance the growth of eco-restoration, restoring ecosystems, and the demands of humanity's built infrastructure. Florida, I think, is one of the most fascinating cases in the world to study, as the place is growing rapidly in population, running out of space. We've had tons of public works projects, so we'll go into that throughout the presentation. First off, though, we're Janitors Without Borders here at HPRT. Our principles is understanding how the world works, looking at our ecosystems as we just discussed. We've been turning it into trash and putting it into our air, into our land, into our water. How do we really focus on life and getting rid of more of that trash we've created and focus more on growing life? I mean, that's really what regeneration and circularity is about. In the history of Florida, it's really interesting what I've learned so far. There's a lot more to learn and explore. In the history of the Native American tribes, you had a lot of these East Coast groups of Native American tribes, which after being persecuted by colonizers, a lot of them had to actually move more south into places that they weren't originally calling home. You had a lot of different groups move into Florida after a while. Here you have the Miami, which is similar to a tribe name that's in Ohio. The Tequesta is near where my family is, but the Miami tribe is closer now towards Okeechobee than where we know where Miami is right there. Our friends over here, they're in Naples, right? So you'd have the Calusa tribe originally over there. But across these different tribes, they did a great job at using their waste as something that could help them with their infrastructure and not something that they really struggled with. These shells that they would use were an important way of them recognizing the past, the land that they live on. They ate with a lot of these shells. These shells are really good. We're learning today how oysters are really good for keeping your water ecosystems very clean. When you grow these shells too, they take out carbon from the atmosphere. They turn life to carbon out of nowhere. So it's nice what you've seen that's being uncovered about the shell mound. So if you want to learn more, look there. The most important ecosystem in Florida is the Everglades, which was originally called the Paheoki, which means grassy water. For those of you that want to read some books about the history of Florida and this stuff, I'll share with you a few in a bit. But from the 1500s to the 1800s, you mainly had the Spanish showing up first, and then the Brits for a bit after the Spanish had control for a while. They were struggling to go inland and move into many of these places. But then it became a territory of the US in 1821 and a state in 1845. But there still wasn't a lot of US people living there for a long time until really the 1900s, when you had railroads being built, which was a really important part of Florida's history and its development. You had people like Henry Flagler on the East Coast. Once you started getting all of these folks down there, you started getting a lot more waste, of course, especially when they treated it like their vacation spots and they weren't being as responsible as we'd hoped, because there was a lot of fraud going on. And this economic bubble burst in 1926 didn't help out with the economic situation in the US. Many of these investors stopped trusting these millionaires. This caused a big issue, as well as these severe hurricanes that swept through in the 20s. So there's an interesting book, Bubble in the Sun, right here, about how Florida actually contributed more to the Great Depression than most people expected. Known as the land of sunshine, people would always go there for their vacations. For more books, I suggest T.D. Allman's Finding Florida. I got these recently, actually. I'm really interested more to learn about the state, its history. The Everglades as an ecosystem is extremely unique on a global level. If you want to learn more about the importance of swamps, bogs, fens, and wetlands, Annie Proulx just wrote an amazing book last year, which is short and does a great job of talking about how some of those important ecosystems to restore are wetlands and neglected often the most. There's a lot of interesting archaeological research coming up too about how ancient cultures changed our lands drastically through draining many wetlands. And even in wars, in circumstances in Greece, this was used as something to hurt the enemy if you really screwed up with their land in various water-like ways. A great article that helped out with some research was by Andrew Fairbanks, Jennifer Wunderlich, and Crystal Remindler. They had a thing called Talking Trash, which is what we're doing here, right? Looking into the history of solid waste management. One thing that I found pretty interesting was there was a group way back, because let me give a little more context, like we talked before in a previous webinar, in many cities that they realized where were some of the most diseases coming from, like cholera, especially in London. And Jon Snow is a legendary figure, not the one from Game of Thrones, but the Jon Snow that pointed to the tap of water, the pipe in London, where most of the disease were coming out from. And that was from the waste and often human excrement that people were drinking that was tied into the water. And once they stopped that tap, the cholera was gone in many ways. So there were people who really came to understand this later on, like these clean city crusaders, Doctors Miller and Terry, because they were going around Florida saying that these new cities, the ways in which we're dealing with our waste is really toxic to our own public health. And that is evident to us. So like this is 110 years ago, where people in Florida were coming to the same understandings as Jon Snow did in London back in the late 1800s. What transformed Florida the most? Of course, it's development. When you get many people who see the opportunity with the Sunshine State and its beautiful circumstances and weather, the development is unlike many other places in the world, especially as you see Disney World and Universal. Tyler or Alan, anything you'd like to say about how Florida's land has been transformed in your lifetimes?
Well, just in Southwest Florida, I've seen it transform dramatically in the last 20 years for Naples. The population growth is astounding. Many of the people from the northern states, as well as Canada and other countries, are all moving here, including Central and South America. So it's kind of the destination state. There's a critical shortage in affordable housing and extreme environmental challenges, especially when you think of the red tide and the red tide outbreaks that happen every year. They're getting worse. Last year, they had a really bad one in Tampa Bay that just affected tens of thousands. People couldn't even breathe their own air in front of their house. It was pretty sad.
I think the biggest thing I see about Florida is that we've got agricultural and industrial. Over the last 200 years, we've got the phosphate stuff going on. We've got the sugarcane stuff going on. And we have a whole series of chain of events just because of laziness of companies that want to jump right to profits. That's one of the bigger problems. They don't follow through and go to the circular approach. They just go to the linear approach. Unfortunately, I think we can help make those corrections in the next century.
You're absolutely right. We'll cover some more of things like the phosphate stacks that you mentioned, Alan, later in this webinar. So thanks for those points, guys. Really helpful for context. One thing I also like to point out that I learned with Tyler last year was there's even some trees that don't belong in Florida that they used to drain out some of these swamps with the development, like the Australian pine. I'm somebody who cares a lot about which kind of ecosystem restoration could we do? There's places where they actually need to untrash certain trees that don't belong there. It's really interesting to learn more about it. But Alan, do you recognize this place? I think you were talking about it earlier.
Yeah, I've driven by that a few times, Mount Trashmore. I think that is probably one of the higher ones, but we've got a good one going here in Collier County too.
Bummer we didn't get the picture for that one then, but maybe in a later call once we have updates on the progress Florida has made around its waste. This is, as you can see, in North Broward County, which is north of Miami. For those of you that don't know the counties of Florida, Mount Trashmore, I guess, named jokingly after Mount Rushmore, which for those non-US folk, that's this famous mountain we have with the president's faces on it. I don't see any faces in this Mount of trash, but it's been there for a while, twice my age at least. There's also another one in Orlando that you see. They turned this garbage mountain into farmland and parks. I wonder what kind of waste is underneath there for the kids to play in. Moving on to more modern times in this century, we're going to go from land, air, and water again, because it's a helpful framework. This is in the Tampa Times. What actually happens to your recycling? They toured a plant to find out. You can check out the article for yourself, but it's just a pretty in-depth look into the Tampa waste systems, and you can look at their rates and their output. It's nothing that's going to impress you, I think. Water-wise, I think this is similar to what you were talking about, Alan, right? Would you like to speak on the ways in which the phosphate stacks north of Tampa have been an issue in the past 5 years, but also especially when hurricanes hit?
Yeah, it's really funny because we actually talked to some people that are responsible for the stuff up in Tampa. Our leadership is so lazy that they just want to put it down a hole. They want to pump all this stuff down a well. I can tell you right now that that's going to go into the aquifer no matter what. It's sort of ridiculous how we like to grab all this stuff and throw it in the hole.
Same with the leachate from landfills. Let it marinate with our groundwater, see what happens over generations.
Yeah, and from the research I learned too, is that's really problematic. Most of Florida is this weird kind of limestone structure. I've actually learned when I was at this conference recently that the limestone structures of Florida, that due to ocean alkalinity, they're eroding in ways and causing even more issues. But Florida can't do landfills like other places like where I grew up in Massachusetts, because they can't go deep. They can't even go like 3 feet below in many cases. So when they want to put it down that hole, it's just like they're living in a different reality, I guess. Moving on to the air, I thought this was a helpful graph put out by some research group saying how the health impacts of landfills are. So if you put it into money turn cost, landfills aren't hurting your health that much. I wonder what Carbotura's health, they would probably be maybe even, I don't know, somewhere over here or negative, but the landfills aren't the best option. But when you do these incinerators, it's like 1, 2.5 times worse in often cases. The Energy Justice Network was just talking about how Florida's the trash incineration capital of the US. This does not make me happy when I know my whole family is living there and my friends and colleagues like Alan and Tyler. This air of the people we care about should be as clean as we possibly can keep it. The taxpayer money should be going to things that are about progress. Any comments from anyone on the team or elsewhere about what we're seeing here about our air?
It's permitted pollution, and it's very well promoted on the side of the people that are doing it. It's kind of sad. Even when talking with climate conscious people, incineration and waste energy to them was a highly valorized solution because they didn't know that there were other solutions. Capturing their imagination and their attention on calls similar to what I had last night with this group of climate activists, they didn't know this solution like this existed. So it was great to let them know that incineration is not a healthy and environmentally safe way to go, and that there are other solutions to landfills, and shared with them what we were doing in that regard. It was very enlightening for them, and it was great for me to share, and I'll be doing a presentation to that community in the coming weeks.
Well, times are clearly changing here. Thank you. Tyler, you know more about this than me. Could you explain PFAS to the crowd? What are PFAS chemicals?
PFAS are forever chemicals found in things from rugs to fabrics and flame retardants to non-stick cookware. They've been found all over the world and in rainwater all over the world now, and they affect health of life on multiple ways. The EPA and these departments of environmental protection and quality among all the states have all been up in arms and trying to figure out what to do with these PFAS, forever chemicals. And it's more of the same of stick it in a hole. Thankfully, we have a solution that addresses PFAS. So it's now just a matter of time as it gets adopted into the stack of solutions, which there aren't very many. PFAS is going to be front and center. The EPA, which was established, I think, in the 70s, a lot of countries have kind of copied it. The big focus of theirs right now is PFAS and remediative efforts.
Wow.
Tyler, as a quick follow-up there, I saw a news segment on those PFAS, and I was just shocked and dismayed about it. When you're talking about you're going to be able to handle it, is it the recyclotron that can handle those types of chemicals?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate it, Steve. Moving on to something that unfortunately happens in the state of Florida, hurricanes, floods, and they involve a lot of trash, right? I think at one point, for some reason, I was thinking, oh, maybe it wouldn't be good to have Carbotura HPRT facilities in Florida. And then I was like, after the Hurricane Ian happened, which when I had to go see it, I was like, wait, that is completely wrong, Jake. Like the places where some of the most waste are produced is actually where these disaster zones are from natural disasters like earthquakes, like hurricanes, but also wars, right? You know, some of the things that produce the most trash, these things like hurricanes, wars, and earthquakes. This year, there's a pile of debris in Florida that could fill 22 Empire State Buildings. How many tons do you think that is?
Oh my God.
Oh, a million tons.
So one expert asked, where are we possibly going to find room for all of this? Does anyone have an answer?
I think the term is called a shit ton.
All right. Well, on to more news. In Miami-Dade, there's been a lot of actual journalism last year. There was a fair amount of developments going on. So here on the right side, you see what? 4 different articles from just the Miami Herald. If you want to check those out, go look for it. But it's talking about odor complaints. By the way, one thing I didn't mention, there's been a lot of lawsuits against companies over the past decades on the odors and other forms of negative outcomes that come from these landfills and other things. These low recycling rates was a topic, more incinerators like we've already covered. Here's an image that you're seeing of one of them. A contract was expiring and the government has been collaborating with various groups to figure out the best options and analyze its waste. I remember reading something about University of Miami Business School helped out with some analysis. And at the end, we'll cover some of these other potential partners we might find in Florida who are working on this. One thing I'd also like to point out is just for fun, but also huge business opportunities to untrash and show the future of why some of the world's biggest amusement parks who have existing great infrastructure for waste, like Disney World has this AVAX logistics infrastructure that's imported from Sweden. It has this like underground tunnel containers of trash moving around all across Disney World from this great Swedish tech. If you look at these rates, it's a lot of waste. Do they even have really artful ways of designing their trash cans? I like it. What if you integrated these beautiful trash cans and this infrastructure of these AVAX logistics with the leading sorts of untrashing facilities? I'm sure this is something that companies like Disney and Universal that want to lead the way on sustainability and talk about it will be very interested in becoming part of progress. Any comments from anyone else on Disney or Universal or some of these other big companies?
Well, we'll certainly be quite valuable to them because with the amount of tourism that goes through there every year, there's a tremendous amount of trash created. And they're all incentivized to close the circularity gap for those larger communities, because ultimately it creates more resilience and allows them to handle more efficiently the mass loads of people that are going to continue to go there into the future.
Yeah, as somebody who went to Disney World as a kid, and I liked it. Epcot helped me become an international kind of culture admiring person. But I don't want to be guilty to say if I don't live in Florida to fly my family down there. But what if you have sustainable flying at that time? What if you have these very circular infrastructure and amusement park? That's something I'd like to dream about. You know, these systems will be where we want them to be.
You were talking about the amount of trash that goes in from all the tourists coming to Disney parks. I just wonder about the Calgary Stampede. We have millions visiting every day, so I could imagine the amount of garbage we go through in Calgary. But Allison, in Toronto, you guys have even more. I could imagine. I'm just like, wow, that is amazing what Disney does.
Ontario produces 50 million tons per year of municipal solid waste.
Some last things I'd like to show is there's some great research coming out about corruption, innovation, and waste management. I want to read this and see what other folks are trying to figure out what's the best way to change these systems and ways that are responsible. There's the Florida Recycling Partnership. Here's some award winners of different companies and leaders that are helping out with recycling. I know Publix, like the grocery market chain, seems to be doing a good job. Like the Florida Recycling Partnership Foundation points out, there's a lot of stakeholders across the country trying to work and focus on this. So we're excited to get to know them better and see how we can collaborate. Because next time that people are flying over these disasters and waste everywhere, we want to have a better response team with these Janitors Without Borders. So thank you all for coming today. Appreciate your time. And I hope you have enjoyed as much learning about this untrashing history as I have. Thank you.